I would say we're in a situation where we could be doing a lot of good things, right? But then again, if we don't sort of have that disciplined pursuit of less, I think we perhaps will not be able to capitalize on the opportunity that we're sitting on.
That's Vikram Rupani, co-founder and president of RedMart, one of Asia's fastest growing online retailers. RedMart is based out of Singapore and was recently acquired by Lazada, which is owned by tech giant Alibaba. Vikram is one of the world's growth leaders. That is, leaders who can drive performance today while transforming the business for tomorrow and energizing their team. I'm Allison Eyring, organization psychologist, CEO, and endurance athlete. I've spent the last 25 years helping companies solve the people and organization challenges of growth. I've worked with all types of CEOs and business leaders across the world, but it takes a special type of leader to successfully grow a business. I call them growth leaders. These leaders seem to have that magic formula, that edge that allows them to drive performance today while transforming their business for tomorrow, and yet still keeping their people energized. Growth Leaders is my new podcast where I'll show you what it takes to successfully lead business growth through conversations with some of the best growth leaders I know. Welcome, Vikram. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here, Allison. Thanks for having me.
Now, Vikram, I would like to start with just a little bit of a personal question. I want you to tell me, what was your first job?
My first official job was coming out of college. I joined JP Morgan as a corporate finance analyst in New York in the industrials and transportation coverage group.
That is an incredibly sophisticated first job. Are you telling me that you didn't work at all when you were in high school?
I did. I had a lot of little jobs helping my dad out.
What was the first one?
In the family business, I used to actually... We have a manufacturing plant, and I used to help actually carry stuff around and, help with production. You could put it that way.
So in fact, it helped you now.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, this is at a completely different scale, more logistics and retail. But I think some of the lessons there of really kind of learning from the ground up, interacting with the people on the ground, I think definitely kind of helped me where I am today at RedMart.
That's a fabulous first job experience. So very quickly tell me, what was your best job and your worst job?
My best job is definitely my current job at RedMart. I think the last 7 years of building the business have been absolutely fantastic. Lots of learning, and there continues to be a lot of learning. I think probably the job that I perhaps didn't enjoy as much was, again, my last job in finance before I left the States and moved to the Middle East and then on to Singapore, where I felt that I was sort of just pushing money around and not really adding value. I was working at a hedge fund and as an analyst over there, and I felt that I wasn't really kind of helping people, and I thought that I could be doing more. So that's sort of what caused me to leave and then sort of explore what the next step was, which landed me here in Singapore to launch RedMart in 2011 with my classmate from INSEAD, Roger.
Tell us a little bit more about your role and what does driving growth mean to you?
Yeah, so I'm co-founder and president of RedMart, responsible for the overall operating business, all the way from operations, technology, finance, retail, marketplace, and so on and so forth. I also work jointly with my co-founders to determine the right strategy and help make sure we prioritize things in the right manner. I think in terms of what driving growth means for us, I think we definitely align ourselves along sort of the principles of growth leadership and intelligent restraint. I think we've come a long way and continue to learn as the years have gone by. I think the main thing for us around driving growth comes, in line with aligning with our sort of principles around customer focus. What we have at RedMart, we call the North Star objectives. And I think, when we define sort of priority, the first number one priority is to ensure that we deliver a fantastic customer experience each time and every time. And if we don't do that, then driving growth really is meaningless because, you are not really delivering on the promise to your customers.
In my book, Pacing for Growth, I describe how I've observed again and again growth leaders practicing something I call intelligent restraint. They push their business and themselves as far and fast as they can, but then no more until they have the right capabilities. The first rule of intelligent restraint is that focus overrules vision. Like in a marathon, vision will get you to the starting line, but it's focus that gets you across the finish. I wanted to get Vikram's thoughts on this. The first rule of intelligent restraint, which is that focus overrules vision. And so for you, that core focus is customer focus or alignment with your customer. Now, that's aligned with what we have found in our research. We find that lots of leaders have visions. We say that the vision kind of gets you to the start line and that it's focus that builds the discipline that you need to get across the finish line. Tell me about a time that you've really had a lot of impact in creating focus.
I think vision is extremely important, the vision and mission, to help people really continue to aspire and know what they're really there for and what the bigger picture is. But then what we do at RedMart is we really drive that down to sort of critical priorities, let's say over a 3-year timeline, linked with a financial goal as well. And those priorities then break down into our business planning process. And from there on, in the business planning process, I think we are now over the years, as I mentioned, have become better and better at sort of practicing intelligent restraint. Maybe you've heard about this book called Essentialism by Greg McQueen. I think one of the things we're learning more is sort of the disciplined pursuit of less is really important. So as we take vision, mission, critical priorities down to business planning goals, we're really starting to pick the top 3 or 5 things that we really want to get done each and every year and really drive those over the finish line. All right. So I think this has been a learning process. I think in the early days of RedMart, obviously there was a lot to get done and there still continues to be. But now that we have that product market fit, we're really looking at ensuring that we continue to drive a fantastic customer experience, but doing so in a manner that allows us to continue to sort of build the capabilities of the organization, the capabilities of our people, meet those goals and objectives, but also do so in a sustainable manner, right? So I'm not saying we don't sprint from time to time, we certainly do that. But I think for us, making sure we only grow in a manner that meets our North Star objectives and happens in a sustainable way where people sort of break their muscles, but then build them again and do so to make them stronger for the longer term. I think that's very important for us.
So it sounds like your journey of focus is about learning how to have more focus. I really like that.
Yeah, it has been. I think, again, they talk a little bit about this in Essentialism about sort of success may lead to failure because of the undisciplined pursuit of more. And I think we've been in those situations before. I think in the early days, 2-3 years into the business, we were seeing a ton of traction. 2015, I think the fundraising markets were good. We were able to raise capital. We were looking at a lot of new business lines, international expansion. And perhaps if you look back now, we weren't ready. We really weren't ready at that point. And then when the market environment changed around us, it became clear that there were, inherent weaknesses in the business that weren't sort of ready to make those bigger leaps. And we had to kind of take a step back. So I think we've learned over the years, but today we're much stronger in terms of driving that focus and being able to relate our vision to more specific things that need to get done, in the nearer term, and we're able to drive that focus to get them done.
I often think that when organizations are in a situation where there's a lot of high growth, because maybe there's this huge market opportunity or they're just in a growth phase, that it often masks mediocrity.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, but that being said, I think it's very important to continue to plant the seeds for the future, because we've seen, even in our business, it's definitely, we look at ourselves as a technology and logistics business. There's a long lead time, especially from a capacity expansion perspective, right? New warehouses take months to put up, even years in some cases. And if you don't start that planning early, and I think you place the right bets at the right time, you will be sort of continuing to grow, but then you will reach a plateau, and the next phase of growth requires you to have put in investments 12, 24 months earlier, which you didn't put in. And not even just investments, perhaps, your people needed to be upskilled. They needed to change the way they think, they needed to develop new skill sets. And if you haven't done that in time and you're not continuously investing in the right things, I think you will find yourself going through a period of growth and then suddenly hitting a wall and wondering what's next, and then scrambling to figure out, okay, how do I restart that engine. And I think so finding that balance is super important.
And what you're saying is so interesting, because it's also about in endurance training, when you have this limit, right? So you have this threshold over which if you perform too often at that level, or you can really hurt yourself. And so it's a good example about building capabilities in really key areas so that you're expanding your capacity so that when you need it, you have it.
Exactly.
The right pace is crucial when you're growing a business. Go too fast and you risk burning out the organization and those around you. Go too slow and you risk being left behind by the competition. I asked Vikram about his experiences pacing for growth. Tell me a little bit about a time in your own career when you felt that you were going too fast, and what did you do about it?
Again, I think if I relate it back to RedMart, I would talk about sort of the year of 2015. At that time, the core business was doing extremely well. But then when we looked around us, there was, the on-demand sort of marketplace businesses really taking up and getting a lot of traction. And, we saw models in the US, the asset-light models, and we figured that, perhaps we should pursue those as well. We started looking at sort of international expansion. We looked at Hong Kong as a market. And again, I think at the core, if I looked at just the core underlying RedMart Singapore business, it was still fairly small. And certainly these were big opportunities, but they were big opportunities that took away focus from the core business and really capitalizing on the foundation that we had built upon in the Singapore market, right? So I think at that time, we really did decide to pull back a little bit in 2016 and sort of recalibrate and see where we were. And that really helped us because, it was a chance to really continue to build upon what we had already laid the foundation for. And then I would say, following that, we were able to kind of relook at some of these opportunities, and some of which we are pursuing now. So I would say that was a time where, we really learned the hard lessons, but managed to get through them.
What about the opposite? Have you ever found that you were going too slow and you needed to speed up?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about that. I think it's hard to come up with an example. It's always been a lot going on in the last 7-8 years. And I think, again, it's sort of the ruthless prioritization is still very important, right? So I think even today, I would say we're in a situation where we could be doing a lot of good things, right? But then again, if we don't sort of have that disciplined pursuit of less, I think we perhaps will not be able to capitalize on the opportunity that we're sitting on.
But I think the disciplined pursuit of less is an example of slowing down, because it requires you to get incredible prioritization, to say no, and to decide what those things are that you really want to go after. So you do have to slow down. We see a lot of organizations that don't slow down enough to prioritize. They say they're too busy, and then everybody's dying.
I think there's no option. I think there's sort of leading indicators that'll kind of make you realize that you're kind of reaching that capacity limit. And I think some of them are very clear in our business. You'll see service levels falling below acceptable levels for a longer period of time than you would expect. So, let's take a simple example like delivery on time. For example, in our business, customer selects a particular delivery slot and expects the package to be there. And, we have a target rate of 97%. There have been times where, that part of the business hasn't necessarily been able to add capacity in the manner that it should have for many different reasons. And you'll start seeing repeatedly that you're not able to even come close to that target. Let's say you're hitting 91, 92, 93%, and that goes on for a long period of time, right? So you have sort of sustained periods where you're not able to meet the service levels that you've promised your customers. I think the other thing that becomes very clear is that people just start getting burnt out, right? So that is also a leading indicator where you'll start seeing the turnover increase because they're so focused on the present and just keeping their heads above water. They start losing sight of the bigger picture and the vision and the mission and why they're there in the first place. And I think, once you start seeing that happen, it's already a little bit too late, right? So if you haven't really pulled back early enough, you land in this situation and then there's a recalibration process that would have to happen, which is quite painful and disruptive as well, right? So I think it's sort of businesses may continue to keep their foot on the gas, but something has got to give at some point in time, especially if you haven't really built those capabilities in the right manner and are at the level where you can cope with that level of working on many different priorities.
I think that is a great example of the dark side of engagement. That we want employees to be very engaged, and that when you're going all out and you're not stopping, you're not recharging, then you get the burnout that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So too much of a good thing is not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big fan of routines. I always lay out my gear the night before to make it easier to start my early morning training. In my company, we have growth routines that periodically involve our clients in the design process to promote external thinking. These routines keep us from over-relying on our strengths and help us get things done while conserving energy for what really matters. The second rule of intelligent restraint that I wrote about was routines beat strengths. And I had so many people disagree with me because they love to talk about their strengths and they love to focus on their strengths. Have you ever experienced a time when you see that you or others have been over-relying on a strength, and what's happened?
Yeah, we have one of our key cultural values at RedMart is never, never, never give up. Famous words of Winston Churchill. And, that's gotten us through a lot. I would say any startup is obviously hard and most don't make it, and even getting to the level that we've gotten to is obviously a big achievement. And I think one of the key reasons is that very early on when we sat around as a sort of leadership team and sort of wanted to codify our values, this was something that clearly was a behavior that we found in the sort of people that we attracted to the organization. And we said, this is clearly a value that we want to live by. And it was clearly a strength because when you go through the roller coaster of building a business, there are periods where you ask yourself, well, are we going to make it? And how do we get through this? But that persistence and the attitude of never, never, never give up lets you get through a lot of the hardships that, you wouldn't otherwise get through if you didn't have that mindset. So I see that as a strength, but oftentimes that gets overused and leads down to a path of not planning sufficiently. And I'll give a good example, right? So over the last few years, we've expanded capacity many times, built new warehouses and so on and so forth. And up until the most recent, one or two warehouses, we never really had a proper sort of governance structure around program management to really put up the right sort of warehouse capabilities and so on and so forth. But what used to end up happening was because we had a team that was so dedicated, they would go all out and make sure things just happened, right? And that would mean really overstretching themselves, right? So we're supposed to go live the following morning, but X, Y, and Z is not done. And, you'll have a team of people who are willing to really commit themselves and be in the warehouse all night to make sure the last levels of configuration are put into place and so on and so forth. Systems are working, everything is ready to go. And that only works up until a certain scale. It's fantastic, it's a strength, and it gets you to a certain point. But then if you don't put in the routines, you're not going to be able to scale beyond a certain point, right? And we've seen that very clearly because now the capacity expansions that we're going through are so complex and involve so many stakeholders that no matter what the team's attitude is and no matter how positive it is, unless you have that proper governance planning structure in place with people doing things at the right time, in the right cadence, with the right sequencing, the right stakeholders involved, you're not going to be able to get through, right? Or you're not going to be able to deliver on time. You may still be able to get through, but I think the output would not be sort of as expected. You'll probably have budget overruns, you'll probably have sort of missing deadlines and so on and so forth. So I think that we're very proud of that value and the persistence of our team and our people, and how far we've come, and I think it's clearly a strength. But I think that as we continue to grow and scale, we are seeing more and more places in the business where it's absolutely essential to put those routines in place, and it's working for us.
Well, you remind me that early in my career I worked for PepsiCo Food Systems, and that was when Pepsi owned the restaurants that are now Yum.
Yeah.
And we had a team that would go and build new restaurants. And I remember they built a Taco Bell in 2 days. But it was, of course, horrible. After it was put in place, they had to fix it and do everything. And it's a great example of what you're talking about that you can make something work, but you can't necessarily replicate it.
Yeah.
I think that the idea of putting in routines in place that can conserve energy and allow you to build and grow are really important. But you also remind me of something that I always like to say, which is that sometimes you have to learn to be good enough when good is enough. So sometimes you need to create routines that can allow you to scale. And then the other time is you say, when is it okay just to be good enough? Growth leaders need to manage their own energy and help their teams to manage theirs. I believe that energy is a strategic asset. Now, your job is a tough one, and you have a lot going on. You have a family. Tell me, what is it that you do to manage your own energy?
Yeah, I think for me, I have some sort of routines and mindsets that I use. I think for me, firstly, I think I take good care of myself physically. Lots of exercise, nourish well, sleep well. I think the other thing that's very important for me personally is just investing in relationships, whether it's with my wife, my kids, my parents, my siblings, my friends. I do take the time to do that, because I find that if I'm kind of balanced personally, then when I get to work, any challenge is sort of, I look at it as an opportunity. So I think for me, I have a very clear needs, and I know if I meet those needs, then I'm able to really perform well and keep my energy levels really high. And I think, and the other thing I would point out is I'm sort of I don't know whether you've heard this term, the Stockdale paradox. I'm a big believer of this. There's this general called James Stockdale, and the one thing he said is you should never lose sight of sort of what's right in front of you, right? And you need to put in the effort to make sure you tackle the issues right in front of you, work hard and really get things done. But overall, you should also never lose faith that you'll prevail at the end, right? So there's this overarching belief that you will always end up in the place where you want to end up, and you have that ultimate faith and trust that'll happen. But that doesn't mean you don't focus on what needs to get done today, right? And I think that's sort of something I'm very vocal about, even with my teams, and I shamelessly practice that, guys, we'll get through this no matter what happens. But that doesn't mean you don't do what's necessary today to really get through it.
It's a great example of that. When we talk about growth leaders, or growth leadership, we say, well, there's 3 dimensions. There's the perform, transform, and energize. And I think that's a great example of you got to maintain the right balance between the perform and transform. You can't just have one or the other.
Yeah.
So I love that. If you want to scale your business, then you also have to scale your people. To do this, you need growth leaders at all levels of your organization. First, you have to be able to identify growth leaders and people with the potential to become growth leaders. Time and time again, I've been asked, how does one spot a growth leader? And we worked very hard in my company to develop tools that help companies identify and develop growth leaders within their business. But I wanted to find out how Vikram spots growth leaders. One of the things that a lot of companies want to know is, how do you identify a growth leader? And then why is it that sometimes they fall through the cracks? And so I just want to ask you, when you are thinking about people who work for you or that you worked with, how do you spot a growth leader?
Yeah, so I was thinking how we've evolved as a company and looking at sort of the people who've really been successful in our environment. And I think there's a couple of characteristics that came across. One thing is, the ability to kind of zoom in and zoom out as and when needed and do that very flexibly. So someone who can be sort of transactional and transformational depending on what the situation calls for. And I think that is really important because, again, as you said, sort of focus over vision, right? Yes, you need to set the vision, but then you also need to drive down and drive the focus, right? So I think it fits a lot with that, and that happens a lot, right? When you're moving so fast in the technology business, of course, you don't change the vision every year or every 3 years or even 5 years for that matter. You have that overarching aspiration, but still being able to switch gears and change your leadership style depending on the time and place, I think is very important, and the audience as well. I think the other one is someone who is able to push decision making down as far as possible into the org. And I think we've seen this at RedMart, really being able to scale, the reason why we've been able to do this, also putting in place the routines, building the capabilities of people to make sure that the right decisions will get made. Of course, that's a learning process to build that autonomy and also build that confidence in the team to be able to make those big decisions. The other thing I would say is a positive mindset, especially in the face of adversity. And this goes with what I said about sort of the value, the main cultural value of never give up, right? We'll get through this no matter what happens, and being able to deal with situations in a very calm manner and get through them and also lead your team through them. And I think the final thing relates to what you lay out in your book very nicely is intelligent restraint, right? Again, coming back to being able to know when it's time to sprint, when it's time to take a step back, being able to focus, prioritize. I think those are sort of core components of people that we've seen have been very successful in our environment, and I think would be successful in any sort of environment. Yeah.
What's the one thing that you're doing to make sure that RedMart is future ready?
It's a fine balance, right? Again, because there's a lot going on right now. But I think there's a few things that we do very prescriptively and are very conscious about doing. One is obviously having a very clear vision that drives down into focused planning and clear initiatives of what needs to be done. And also not changing that, right? So taking the time and being very thoughtful of where we want to go and how we want to get there. And then sort of getting on with it, right? But I think oftentimes when you see too much flip-flop, or you see sort of, we set one direction and then you shift gears for whatever reason, right? There may be some good reasons, but it can't be that you then do a 180 and then you do another 180. I mean, people just get confused and they get tired, they get sort of, just running after the next shiny thing. I think that it's important that we kind of stay the course. So we are very disciplined about being focused. And I think, again, we've learned over the years, and I think we're getting better and better at it. The other thing is communication, right? I think people want to know what situations mean for them personally. It can't be sort of a generalized message. I think everyone is keen to understand the bigger context, right? And you can't expect people to just do as you say they should do, right? And I think if you give people the right context, you'll be surprised with sort of the results that come out, because they'll come up with sort of better solutions than perhaps you would have even thought of or considered, right? And especially if you have that happening in a group setting, I mean, overall, it's super accretive, because every idea just builds upon each other, right? So we see that happening, but that can only happen if you're transparent and open about the communication. And I think that comes with trust as well, right? Over a period of time, being authentic leaders and really building the trust with the organization. And maybe not all news is good news, right? Maybe there are things that we decide, for example, when we decided not to pursue the Hong Kong international expansion, it was a tough decision, but it was the right decision at that point in time. So I think being transparent, helping people understand the reasoning behind why we make certain decisions, understanding the context, and also then understanding what it means for them, I think is super important. And then finally, I would say is the continuous investment in people, right? I think we have a quarterly cadence where we have a lot of investment in training and development for the senior leadership team, which is sort of the second bench at RedMart, group of 40, 50 people who will be the leaders of the future of the business, right? And I think really spending the time to build the right mindset, ways of working, attitudes, skills, hard skills. I think really spending that time and effort and doing it in a disciplined way and very thoughtful way, where you build upon sort of the previous sessions, and over a period of time you come out with this group of people that is so fantastic, and you have full confidence that can kind of lead the business, right? So I think that's really important. So those are the three things I think are critical to make sure that we are ready for the next phase of growth.
When you talked about communication, you made me think about how today more and more companies are realizing the importance of personalization in terms of consumers and choices. And as you were talking, I thought about the importance of personalization of messages and communications, that we tend to think about blasting out messages. And what I was hearing you talking about was being very personal and in how you're communicating and what you're communicating to people.
I agree. And I think like the sequencing is important. Different employee groups have different needs, different things that motivate them. Of course, there's the overarching vision of what we want to be and what we want to aspire to be. But that being said, if you look at our business, we have a big population of technology, software development, product management. We have a blue collar workforce. They work in the fulfillment center and the last mile delivery. Then we have the business teams, the retail, the marketplace. They're very different employee groups. And actually, while we're all under the same umbrella, I think, the messaging really needs to be thoughtful in a way that really accommodates for people's own personal needs and what's important to them. So I think that is something that we really spend time thinking about and making sure that we do in the right way.
Another example of going slow, taking time to communicate the right messages.
Yeah.
Vikram, thank you very much for joining me today. You're a great growth leader, and I love to hear your story, and I appreciate your time.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks to Vikram for joining me today, and especially for his insights on identifying and developing growth leaders. I'm Allison Eyring. Thanks again for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to Growth Leaders for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.